They called me poor in the middle of a mahogany dining room that I owned. Not rented, not shared, but owned. Down to the deed in a filing cabinet that bore my signature. My name is Madison Silverthorne, and for most of my life, my extended family thought I was a failure. At the Silverthorne family's monthly strategy dinners, everyone came armed with business bragging rights. Welcome to Turning Tables Stories channel. I'm currently enjoying a warm coffee while watching The View, taking a quiet moment to reflect on stories like Madison's, where true power is often hidden in plain sight. Before we see her flip the script, where are you watching from and what's your favorite drink? Now, let's head back to that mahogany dining room. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive Cabernet and the even more expensive perfume of people who had never known a day of actual labor. I sat at my usual spot, the far end of the table, where the lighting was just dim enough for me to be ignored, yet bright enough for them to see my thrift store wool sweater. My cousin, Alexis, leaned in, her eyes gleaming with that predatory sort of pity she'd perfected since we were 10. She adjusted a gold bangle that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget and let out a soft, sharp laugh. "So, Madison," she began, making sure the entire table heard her. "I was driving through the North Side yesterday and saw you walking into that, what was it, a duplex on Marion Street? You're still in that little apartment, aren't you, even at 34? The table went quiet. It was the kind of silence that wasn't respectful. It was anticipatory. They wanted to see me flinch. They wanted to see the disappointment of the Silverthorne name finally admit that she couldn't keep up. My Aunt Stephanie gave a faux sympathetic sigh, dabbing her lips with a silk napkin. "It really is time to own something real, dear. Excellence is in our blood, after all. Renting, at your age, it's just not very adult." I didn't cry. I didn't defend my choice to live simply. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I simply reached for the crystal pitcher of sparkling water and poured myself a glass. My hands were perfectly steady. While they were busy discussing the square footage of their latest vacation homes, I felt the cold, hard weight of my phone in my lap. Under the table, my thumb moved with practiced precision. I didn't need to look at the screen. I opened a high-security messaging app and typed a short, 6-word code to my lead property manager. "Rowan, activate Protocol 7 immediately. Full audit and termination of all residential subsidies at the Heights, effective tonight." The Heights was the most prestigious residential wing of Silverthorne Plaza, the crown jewel of Chicago real estate. My family didn't know I owned it through Cobalt Ridge Partners. More importantly, they didn't realize that for the last 10 years, they'd been living in the penthouse units of that very building only because of my signature unwitting beneficiaries of a legacy fund they assumed came from thin air. I hit send at precisely 7:51 in the evening. By 7:55, a notification buzzed against my leg. Confirmed. Notices issued to tenants. Management fees adjusted to market rate. All subsidies retracted. I set my phone down and looked at Alexis. I didn't smile, but I felt the first ripple of a different kind of power. This wasn't a family dinner anymore. It was an accounting. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years. And tonight, the line of credit was officially closed. I watched my Uncle Thomas swirl his vintage wine, boasting about his shrewd negotiation skills that had supposedly secured their penthouse at a price no one else could touch. He believed he was a master of the market. He didn't realize he was just a beneficiary of my silence. For 10 years, I had been the invisible hand, keeping their world from collapsing. Through a series of nested shell companies under Cobalt Ridge Partners, I had established a specific fund that covered exactly 60% of the operating costs for their units at the Heights. I wasn't doing it out of love. I was doing it as a social experiment to see if financial security would ever breed a single ounce of genuine gratitude. It didn't. Instead, it bred a toxic kind of entitlement that eventually became their default setting. It's a strange and devastating phenomenon in human psychology. The trap of normalizing cruelty. When a family identifies one member as the weak link, that person becomes a psychological dumping ground for everyone else's insecurities, a process known as scapegoating. They didn't hate me because I was a failure. They hated me because my refusal to play their high-stakes game of appearances acted as a silent mirror, reflecting the hollow reality of their own lives. In their eyes, I had to be the poor, struggling cousin. Because if I wasn't the failure they needed me to be, then their expensive titles and leased luxury cars didn't actually make them superior to anyone. They had normalized the act of biting the hand that fed them because I had made that hand invisible. Over the last decade, I had invested nearly $20 million in their comfort. I had paid for the building repairs they ignored, the security staff they mistreated, and the very lifestyle they were currently using to mock me. Every time Stephanie bragged about her exclusive connections at Silverthorne Plaza, she was really bragging about a discount I had personally authorized through a ledger she wasn't allowed to see. My aunt reached for a second helping of lobster, her eyes never once meeting mine with anything other than disdain. "You know, Madison," she said, her voice airy and dismissive, "we really only keep inviting you to these dinners so you don't forget what real success looks like. It would be a shame for the Silverthorne name to completely fade into the background of some drafty rental apartment." The table erupted in appreciative chuckles. I looked at the mahogany surface, feeling the grain beneath my fingertips, the same wood I had selected for the lobby of the building they called home. This wasn't a family dynamic anymore. It was a bad business deal. And as any logistics professional will tell you, when the overhead of a relationship exceeds the value of the emotional asset, you liquidate. I wasn't just stopping the payments tonight. I was auditing the total debt of their character, and the results were officially bankrupt. Uncle Thomas stood up, clearing his throat with a practiced, authoritative rumble. The chandelier light caught the edges of his crystal glass as he tapped it with a silver spoon, a signal for silence that everyone obeyed instantly, except for me. Since Madison is so comfortable with her modest lifestyle, he began, casting a long, disparaging look toward my end of the table. "The trustees of the Silverthorne family estate have reached a unanimous decision. Madison, you've proven you don't need much to survive. Your portion of the trust will be reallocated to Joshua and Alexis, who actually understand the responsibility of representing this name." I didn't blink. I didn't reach for a tissue. I simply watched the smug satisfaction spread across their faces like a slow-moving stain. Alexis didn't even look up from her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. "Just posted the group photo," she whispered loud enough for the table to hear. Caption: "Knowing your worth means knowing who doesn't fit the brand. 34 and still a guest at someone else's success. Hashtag Silverthorne Legacy." They thought this was my social death sentence. They expected a breakdown, a plea for mercy, a desperate reminder that I was family. What they didn't understand was the psychology of the survivor. I spent years in what I call the survivor's chain, a silent, invisible prison where you endure the cruelty not because you are weak, but because you are collecting the very stones they throw to build a fortress they can't scale. For a decade, I allowed them to believe I was the one being hunted, the one barely scraping by. But silence isn't a lack of power, it's a strategic reserve. While they were busy canceling me from a trust that I already knew was empty because of their own greed, I was busy looking at the spreadsheet in my mind. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, and they had just defaulted on the last remaining grace period. "Is that all, Uncle Thomas?" I asked, my voice as level as a ledger line. He scoffed, sitting back down, as if he'd just finished a tiring chore. "It's enough. You can finish your water, Madison, but don't expect an invitation next month. We're moving in a different direction, a more sophisticated one." I stood up slowly, the heavy mahogany chair making a dull sound against the marble floor. "I agree," I said. "A different direction is exactly what this family needs." I walked out of the room without looking back. I didn't need to see their confusion. I had a meeting with a different kind of authority. As I stepped into the cool Chicago night, my phone buzzed again. It was a message from Amanda, my lead counsel. Forensic audit of your father's estate is complete. We found the missing $4,600,000. It's exactly where you suspected. The game was no longer about dinner seating. It was about to become a matter of public record. I pulled my 10-year-old Subaru into the executive parking garage of Silverthorne Plaza, the very building my family called home. The security guard didn't recognize the car, but he recognized the black titanium access card I held against the reader. The gates opened in a smooth, mechanical whisper. I didn't head to the residential wing where my aunt and uncle were currently laughing about my poverty. Instead, I took the private elevator to the 64th floor, the penthouse offices of Cobalt Ridge Partners. The lobby of my firm was a stark contrast to the mahogany-heavy museum my family lived in. It was all industrial glass, polished concrete, and a view of the Chicago skyline that felt like it belonged to me, because, in many ways, it did. My lead counsel, Amanda, was already there, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows with a tablet in her hand. She was 62 years old, sharp as a surgical blade, and had been the primary architect of my corporate shield for the last decade. The dinner went exactly as you predicted, I said, dropping my thrift store bag onto the obsidian conference table. They officially removed me from the family ledger tonight. They called me an ungrateful guest at someone else's success. Amanda didn't offer a sympathetic smile. She knew I didn't want one. She simply tapped a command on her screen. Then, the grace period is officially over. I have the formal notices ready for Silverthorne Plaza. Ownership of units 501 through 510. The Heights is being transferred from the Legacy Trust to Cobalt Ridge's direct management. I walked over to the windows, looking down at the city. My family believed they were untouchable because of the Silverthorne name, but they had spent 30 years treating that name like a credit card with no limit. They had forgotten that names don't pay property taxes, entities do. And Cobalt Ridge was the entity that had been footing their bill. Send the notices, I said. My voice was clinical, devoid of the heat that usually accompanies a family feud, and terminate the subsidy. Effective at midnight, the rent for those units will adjust to the current market rate of $24,000 per month. If they can't provide proof of income within 48 hours, start the eviction proceedings. Amanda hesitated for only a second. That's a jump of nearly $15,000 from what they've been paying under the legacy discount. They'll be bankrupt by the end of the quarter. This isn't revenge, Amanda, I replied, turning to look at the documents on the screen. It's accounting. For 10 years, I've been a silent investor in their version of a family. I've subsidized their arrogance and paid for the very tongues they use to insult me. Tonight, I'm simply rebalancing the sheet. As the clock struck midnight, I watched the send confirmation glow on the tablet. Hundreds of legal documents were now hitting the inboxes of every tenant in the building, but the ones destined for the penthouse units were the most lethal. The invisible sister was gone. In her place was the majority stakeholder of their entire existence. The professional escalation had begun, and unlike my family's drama, my retaliation followed the law of the ledger. Cold, factual, and irreversible. Amanda pulled a separate file from the obsidian desk, one marked with my father's initials. For years, the narrative in the Silverthorne family was that my father had been the weak brother, the one who had mismanaged his inheritance and died with nothing but debts. I had lived with that lie for over 2 decades. I had accepted the charity of Stephanie and Thomas because I believed my father had left me a burden of shame. But as I watched the data scroll across the screen, the balance sheet of my childhood began to rewrite itself with lethal precision. We spent the last 48 hours comparing the digital scans of your father's final business filings with the withdrawal slips from the Legacy Trust, Amanda said, her voice dropping into a register of cold professional fury. Look at the authorization for the $4,600,000 transfer, the one that allegedly liquidated his remaining assets 2 weeks after his funeral. She zoomed in on a signature. It was my father's name, written in his characteristic cursive. But beneath the high-resolution forensic overlay, the discrepancies were undeniable. The pen pressure was inconsistent. The terminal strokes were hesitant. "This isn't a signature, Madison. It's a trace," Amanda said. "The forensic handwriting expert confirmed it an hour ago. Your Aunt Stephanie and Uncle Thomas didn't just manage your father's estate. They forged his authorization to drain the trust before you were old enough to ask questions. They used your father's death as a capital injection for their own failing ventures." I felt a wave of clarity wash over me, colder and sharper than anything I'd felt before. My compassion hadn't just been overdrafted. It had been stolen. I looked at the timestamps on the ledger. The $4,600,000 had been withdrawn and immediately routed through a series of offshore accounts before landing in a domestic entity used to purchase the very penthouse they now occupied. They hadn't just mocked me for being poor. They had manufactured my poverty to fund their luxury. They had sat across from me for 10 years, dabbing their mouths with silk napkins and calling me a worthless burden, while living on the interest of a crime committed against an orphaned girl. This is felony fraud and forgery. Under the discovery rule, the statute of limitations only starts the moment the victim finds the evidence, and today, I am handing the district attorney everything they need for an indictment. I didn't feel a need for an apology anymore. You don't negotiate with a virus. You eradicate it. The criminal twist had stripped away the last remaining threads of familial obligation. There was no Silverthorne brand left to protect. Only a ledger of crimes that needed to be settled in full. "Rowan," I said into the intercom, not taking my eyes off the forged signature, "add the forensic audit to the media packet and call the district attorney's office. I have a $4,600,000 debt that needs to be collected by the state." The lobby of Cobalt Ridge Partners was silent except for the frantic clicking of high heels on polished concrete. I sat in my high-backed executive chair, facing the window, watching the gray mist roll off Lake Michigan. Behind me, the heavy glass doors burst open, a calculated security breach I had personally authorized to allow them this one final entrance. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The scent of desperation always precedes a Silverthorne. "We need to speak with the managing director immediately," Uncle Thomas shouted, his voice cracking with a frantic energy I hadn't heard at dinner. "There's been a catastrophic clerical error. Our residential accounts at the Heights have been flagged for eviction. We are the Silverthorns. We don't pay $24,000 a month for units our family helped build." Aunt Stephanie's voice was high and shrill, overlapping his. "This Cobalt Ridge entity is trying to extort us. Joshua and Alexis have been locked out of their amenity suites. This is a PR nightmare." I slowly rotated my chair. The silence that followed was so thick, it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. They stood there, huddled together like a pack of wet, confused animals. Alexis dropped her designer bag. Joshua's jaw hung open. Thomas turned a shade of gray that matched the Chicago skyline. "Hello, family," I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. "I believe you're looking for me." "Madison?" Stephanie whispered, her manicured hand flying to her throat. "What is this? Why are you in this office?" "I am this office, Stephanie," I replied, standing up to lean against the obsidian desk. "I am Cobalt Ridge Partners. I am the managing director. And as of midnight, I am your landlord." Thomas stepped forward, his face contorted in a mix of fury and disbelief. "You? This is some sick joke. You've been living in a dump on Marion Street. You drive a car that belongs in a junkyard." I didn't lose my temper. I looked at them through the lens of a psychological truth they were finally forced to face. The total collapse of the empty wallet power illusion. For decades, they had built their entire identity on the word have, having the name, having the penthouse, having the status. But they had forgotten the word be. Their position was a shell, a luxury garment they had rented using my silence and, as it turned out, my father's stolen money. When the money stopped, They didn't just lose their apartments. They lost their humanity because they had no internal character to stand on once the floor was pulled out from under them. Their power was never theirs. It was a line of credit I had personally extended and then revoked. The dump on Marion Street is one of 12 properties I own outright. Thomas, I said, sliding a thick folder across the desk. But that's irrelevant now. What is relevant is that the Silverthorne Plaza Board has reviewed the forensic audit. Your lease subsidies were terminated because they were funded by $4,600,000 that was illegally siphoned from my father's trust. Thomas reached for the desk to steady himself. Madison, please, we are family. We can work this out privately. Think of the name. The name Silverthorne is a punchline now, I said, my voice echoing in the vast, cold space. I've already signed the final eviction notices. You have 48 hours to vacate the Heights. Any personal property left behind will be seized as collateral for the $4,600,000 you embezzled, pending a court-ordered restitution. Security will escort you to the service elevator. I sat back down and picked up a pen, returning to my ledger. I didn't watch them leave. The sound of their retreat was the most honest thing they had ever given me. Within a month, the name Silverthorne Plaza was chiseled off the building's limestone facade. I renamed it Cobalt Ridge Plaza, a tribute to the firm I built on sweat and integrity rather than theft and arrogance. The mahogany boardrooms were open to local nonprofits, and the forensic audit was handed over to the district attorney to settle the debt of the $4,600,000 stolen from my father's estate. Stephanie and Thomas were forced to liquidate every asset they had left to begin the long process of restitution. They moved from the Heights to a cramped rental unit in the suburbs, the very kind of starter condo they used to mock me for at our strategy dinners. Alexis and Joshua, whose entire identities were wrapped in a brand they never actually earned, discovered that when the money stops, the spotlight goes dark. I didn't feel joy in their fall. I simply felt the silence of a balance sheet that was finally correct. I still live in my apartment on Marion Street. I still drive my old Subaru. People often ask me why I don't move to the penthouse suite now that I own the whole building. I tell them that I prefer the view from my fire escape. It reminds me of the years I spent watching the city, building a future choice by choice, while everyone else was busy performing success. I have come to realize that the most powerful thing you can do when people count you out is to let them. Their underestimate is your greatest strategic reserve. If you find yourself in a similar situation, feeling like the invisible one or the disappointment of the family, please remember this. Your worth is not a subscription service that others get to cancel. Do not waste your breath defending your life to people who are only listening for a reason to judge you. Instead, build in silence until your reality becomes a reckoning they cannot ignore. Forgiveness isn't always about making peace with the person who hurt you. Sometimes, it is the act of cutting the cord so you can finally find your own peace. If the journey of Madison has given you the courage to see your own value, please hit that follow button so you don't miss our next stories of justice and self-respect. Share this video with one person you know who is currently working in the shadows. They might just need this reminder that they are enough, exactly as they are.